Hi everyone, I'm Professor Trent. Welcome to your World Religions, Chapter 2 Lecture Summary. So please join me in your book. I am on page 3132 in the third edition. So realize that your book edition might be different. So you have different page numbers. As I state the page numbers in this lecture summary, if your page numbers are a little bit different, don't be alarmed. It's just a slight difference in the edition. All right, friends, so we are on Chapter 2, which is North American Indigenous Traditions. Your book calls them Indigenous Religions of North America, but religion is actually quite a Western term. So I tend to use the term Indigenous Tradition or Indigenous Spirituality. So if you hear me say Indigenous Spirituality, what I mean by that is indigenous religious traditions. All right, friends. So by now, you have taken a look at Module 2, Chapter 2 in Blackboard. You've watched all the videos. You've heard from Ray Buckley. You've looked at the video with Dr. Mann. You are very familiar with indigenous traditions of North America. If you don't know anything about what I'm talking about, please go back to the module 2, Chapter 2, and please watch all of the videos, read all of the articles. They are wonderful supplemental materials for Chapter 2. This is a lecture summary, not intended to replace your reading. It is merely to summarize the key points that you are to glean from Chapter 2. All right, so let's back up a little bit and talk about Chapter 1. Chapter 1 was about the academic study of religions or spirituality. And I gave you a definition that I do want us to continue to use. It's on page 9, and it's based on Emil Durkheim, the famous sociologist's definition. And this is the definition. A religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things pertaining to God or not. Pertaining to God or not. That is my own edit, Professor Trent's edit. And the reason I include that edit is because some religious and spiritual traditions actually do not have a construct of theism. And if you've studied Chapter 1, you know what theism is. Theism. If you don't remember, go back and look, all right? So in Chapter 2, based on Chapter 1, we know what a religious tradition is. We know what the 3-question framework of studying an academic religion and spirituality is. And that is, what is the ultimate reality? Where do we come from? What is the way of life? How should we live? What is the ultimate purpose? Where are we going? Ultimate reality, way of life, ultimate purpose. Those 3 categories or questions make up the framework, the box for us for studying all of our subsequent traditions. So your textbook outlines those 3 categories and applies it to every tradition that we will study, including indigenous traditions. Now, something to note, very important to note, that the 3-question or category framework when applied to indigenous traditions is pretty broad. And the reason for that is because indigenous traditions are native and unique to a specific time, place, and people. All right, that's the definition of indigenous. Native to a specific time, place, and people, specifically place. In Chapter 2, we're focused on North America. In Chapter 3, we will move over to Africa. So all that is to say, these 3 categories remain pretty broad at this point. They don't start to begin to get super specific until Chapter 4, which is Hinduism. But let's look at the 3 categories in relation to indigenous traditions of North America. So if you'll meet me on page 32, let's talk about where we are in time and space. Place, we are in the continent of North America. This should look familiar to you. On this map on page 32, they even have listed on here the Cherokee Nation. You all, as residents of North Carolina, live in Cherokee Nation. That is the indigenous land that belongs to the Cherokee Nation. All right. You also probably have heard of other tribes and communities that are indigenous to North Carolina. If you've ever been to Lumberton or studied any Lumbee history, if you've been to Catawba, but Cherokee is probably the name that you're most familiar with. How many of you have been to Cherokee in Western North Carolina? Raise your hands. If you've been to Cherokee in Western North Carolina and you've watched the video that I've posted about Cherokee, North Carolina, you will see that there is a distinction between the tourism part of Cherokee and the rich native indigenous tradition of the Cherokee community. So be sure to watch that video. So we all live in Cherokee Nation, page 32. Now let's talk about the timeline. We are officially at approximately 20,000 BCE. BCE stands for before the Common Era. ERA, before the Common Era. You probably knew it before as BC, but historians have changed this abbreviation to BCE, before the Common Era. So we're 20,000 years ago, BCE, in the continent of North America. So let's start with the categories. Ultimate reality. What emerges from the continent of North America 20,000 years ago are narratives. That should sound familiar. You know them from chapter 1 as myths, but remember that we're using the term narratives. Narratives are a powerful source of sacred truth. A powerful source of sacred truth. Narratives are the stories and sacred truths that are passed along generation to generation, particularly among indigenous communities. Now remember, whereas in your tradition or tradition that you're familiar with, there might be a written sacred text. Well, before there were written sacred texts, there were spoken sacred narratives. And so indigenous traditions are focused on the sacred narratives that are spoken. So ultimate reality covers where do we come from? And there are many narratives in the indigenous traditions that talk about humanity's origins, the world's origins, the origin of animals. If you watch Dr. Mann's video, you remember hearing about that beautiful story, narrative from the Cheyenne people. If you haven't heard it, go back and listen to it. So I'm on page 35, Creation and Origins. So what's common amongst these narratives is that there is some kind of creation force in indigenous traditions of North America, whether it's holy wind, whether it is the great creator. The creator has a specific name in the Cheyenne tradition. If you watch that video, you heard that name. And the creator is what brings into being all life. And different communities call this by different names. But what's important for you to know is that amongst indigenous traditions of North America, there's often a creation narrative. Popol on page 36 is what becomes a sacred creation story narrative about the origin of humanity and animals. So that's on page 36 if you want to go back and review that. Your book gets into lots of details about these creation narratives. Feel free to go back and dig deeper into those. You won't need to memorize all of these details. What's important for you to know is that the indigenous traditions of North America have creation narratives, and that is part of their ultimate reality. And given the ultimate reality, what are humans and animals called to do? Meet me on page 39. So the main theme that runs through the way of life in indigenous traditions is balance. The balance between the natural world and humanity. And if you've studied North American indigenous rituals, you know that balance of time and space and the earth and care for the earth is very, very important. And as you read through chapter 2, you got really specific examples on rituals of balance. But the importance of sacred places, sacred time, sacred spaces, sacred language, the observance of all of these things helps maintain balance in the natural world and in humanity. And when that balance is thrown off, it has to be restored. And it's restored through rituals. And your book talks about several of those rituals as you go through this section on way of life. And also towards the end of the chapter, many of those rituals are covered. So ultimate reality, creation narratives. way of life, a focus on balance and restoration between the natural world and humanity. And then let's move to ultimate purpose. North American indigenous traditions are often rooted in what's known as cyclical time. So think the seasons, the 4 seasons. Nature is very cyclical. It's not linear at all, which means life, death, and a rejuvenation of life and death over and over and over as we see in the seasons. And so the ultimate purpose in North American indigenous traditions varies from community to community, but the idea is that we are always connected to the land and that there is a cyclical nature between life, death, and repeating the cycle over and over again. We'll get into a specific in just a moment. So I do want to talk about page 45. So meet me on page 45, colonization. It is important to note that most of the North American indigenous traditions that you may be familiar with today have an influence of Christianity. And the reason for that is, of course, colonization, brutality against indigenous peoples, and also what's called the 1819 Civilization Fund Act. This is where children were taken from their parents and their grandparents, their families. They were sent to Christian boarding schools, given Christian names, taught English, and stripped of all their indigenous heritage. Now, what happens when something like that occurs, not only is it atrocious historically and criminal against humanity, but there's also a significant loss in the culture, language, religion, spirituality, and rituals of the native peoples. Because now that language disappears, the names disappear, the narratives disappear, and what is replaced instead is European Christianity from the colonizers. And all this is to say that many of the indigenous traditions that were native to North America have evaporated. They've been erased because of the 1819 Civilization Fund Act. So make sure you go back and read about that. Now, fortunately, especially in the 20th and 21st century, there is a push to restore indigenous traditions, to go back and learn sacred narratives, to learn sacred language, to bring back rituals. And Ray Buckley talks a little bit about that in his video. You also learned about that in the Cherokee language video. And the Native American Church is established in the 20th century, along with the use of peyote among the Native American Church. And that is in effect, if we go back to the timeline, to attempt to restore what was lost in as much as possible from the 1819 Civilization Fund Act. Now, can we go back to pre-colonization time and gain all of the wisdom and knowledge of those North American native narratives and languages? No, they are gone forever. But the idea is that what is left, about 700 communities, is restored through the protection of the Native American Church. And in 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, 1978. And you heard Ray Buckley talk about his particular community, and I think in particular, the narrative that he shared was about the dream catcher, so you can go back and listen to that. But all of that is important because what you see today, whether it's in Cherokee, it's in Lumbee, it's in Catawba, it's at Pembroke, is a fusion of indigenous tradition and spirituality and Christianity, because so much of what once was 20,000 BCE is no longer, and it cannot be restored. But the bits and pieces of the rites and rituals and language and narratives and sacred texts that do still exist, that have been passed on generation to generation, have often been fused with Christianity from the European colonizers. And so in the Cherokee language video, you'll notice that they talk about church, they talk about pastors, you hear familiar tunes that sound like church hymns, but they're sung in Cherokee language. And so you'll notice that fusion. And that's very common in many indigenous communities across North America. So the colonization section is on page 45 if you want to go dig deeply into that. Page 47 is the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. Dr. Mann talks about that as well in her video. Now let's go to some of the particular rituals. So your book does a great job of outlining rites of passage, rites of renewal, rites of purification. I encourage you to go back and look through those. I'm going to especially point out the vision quest. Most students are really interested and curious about a vision quest because in modern American culture, you will often hear people say that thus and so is my spirit animal. And this is actually a reference to the vision quest, although most people that use the term spirit animal do not know where it comes from. And it's actually considered misappropriation for you to have a spirit animal if you are not an indigenous person or part of a native community. So something to keep in mind. I wanted to point that out to you because I know that in American culture, the use of spirit animals is pretty ubiquitous. In the native community, vision quests are very important, and they do typically result in the individual receiving a spirit guide, often in the form of an animal. And so that's where that saying comes from in American culture. I encourage you to look on page 56 and reread the conclusion. Look at the 3 categories under the Seeking Answers section: ultimate reality, how should we live, ultimate purpose, and also review the glossary. A couple of key terms to help you remember from this chapter: the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, Axis Mundi, the Ghost Dance, which is an important turning point in the history of indigenous people in North America in terms of persecution and oppression, Holy Wind, Native American Church, Popovo, rites of passage, rites of renewal, Sundance is also very important. Ray Buckley doesn't talk about it in his video, but he has actually been a participant in the Sundance, Two Spirit, and Vision Quest. There's also additional online resources in your book as well. So what are you to glean from this chapter? I definitely want you to look at the module materials because that will give you a sense of the history of America, the history of indigenous people in North America, what has been lost, what has attempted to be restored, and what is the relationship between the native indigenous community now and American society. That will give you a big picture. What I hope you will glean from this is that there has been misappropriation of North American indigenous rituals and terms, and I want you to be aware of that. And I also want you to be aware of the beautiful and rich history of narratives and rituals and rites that are here on North American soil, which is actually indigenous soil, indigenous land, and we are all living in, at least in North Carolina, in Cherokee Nation. And so I put the native land map on there in your module too, so that you can see specifically, you can even drill down very specifically within North Carolina to see whose community you actually live in when it comes to thinking about historically who lived where on the North American continent. And so those are just some things to take away from this chapter. Some food for thought, especially since you are all residents of North America. It's important for you to know the history of the continent, for you to know its spiritual and religious history, and for you to know its indigenous history. Thanks so much for listening. This has been your chapter summary on Chapter 2, Indigenous Traditions of North America. I'm Professor Trent. Thanks for watching.